Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt the strange, quiet ache of being completely invisible? Not because you lacked presence, but because your presence was too vast, too layered, too complex for the surface-level eyes around you to truly see. Have you ever given someone your silence, your patience, your understanding, your willingness to hold space for their wounds without judgment, only to have them look straight through you as though you were nothing more than a passing shadow on a wall they never chose to examine? There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to women who carry depth the way others carry opinions, quietly, without announcement, without performance, without any desperate need for the world to applaud what they endure in the stillness of their own inner world. And it is precisely this loneliness, this invisible suffering, this refusal to be ordinary, that eventually becomes the very thing that cannot be ignored. There comes a moment, and it does not arrive with fireworks or declarations. It arrives the way dawn arrives, slowly, gently, and then all at once, when a man looks at a woman he thought he understood and realizes, with a kind of quiet terror and profound admiration, that she is nothing like what he assumed. It is not a moment of her doing something dramatic. It is not a moment where she performs strength or demands recognition. It is a moment where her entire way of being, her silence, her restraint, her emotional architecture, the way she holds grief without collapsing, the way she sees through masks without tearing them off, the way she stands in her own solitude without bitterness, reveals something he was never prepared to confront. He realizes, perhaps for the first time in his life, that some women do not exist on the surface. Some women are entire oceans, and he has been swimming in shallow water his entire existence. From the perspective of psychology, most human relationships are built on projections. We do not fall in love with people as they are. We fall in love with the version of them that our unconscious mind has constructed, a version shaped by our wounds, our unmet needs, our childhood templates, and the masks we have learned to wear so convincingly that we have forgotten there is a face beneath them. When a man encounters a woman who has done the rare and painful work of descending into her own depths, who has faced her own shadows and refused to look away, something destabilizing happens to his projection. The image he built no longer holds, and in the crumbling of that illusion, he does not just see her more clearly. He is forced, perhaps unwillingly, to see himself. What most people never realize is that the moment of deepest recognition between two human beings is not a moment of romance. It is a moment of psychological crisis. It is the moment when one person's unconscious recognizes that the other person carries something it has been desperately running from. And it is in that trembling, disorienting, breathtaking instant that the real story begins. Not the story of attraction, but the story of transformation. The story of a man who came seeking comfort and instead found a mirror. The story of a woman who gave her depth freely and in doing so awakened something ancient and terrifying in a soul that had long been sleeping. What we are about to explore together is not a list of traits or behaviors. It is not a guide on how to appear mysterious or how to play games with someone's emotions. What we are about to explore is something far more sacred and far more dangerous. We are going to walk through the psychological landscape of what happens when a man truly, deeply, and irreversibly recognizes that the woman standing before him has been forged by something he cannot name, shaped by suffering he cannot imagine, and held together by a kind of inner architecture that most people will never build in their entire lives. We are going to explore why this recognition changes him, why it terrifies him, and why, if he is brave enough to stay, it becomes the most transformative experience of his existence. Let us begin. The first thing a man notices, though he may not have the language for it, is that her emotional world does not behave the way he has been conditioned to expect. He has spent his life surrounded by emotional performances, by people who announce their suffering like a currency, who weaponize vulnerability, who cry loudly, not because they are breaking, but because they want to be witnessed breaking. He has been trained, through years of unconscious social conditioning, to associate femininity with emotional chaos, with neediness, with an endless hunger for reassurance, and then she arrives. And she is nothing like that. Not because she is cold, not because she is detached, not because she has hardened herself against feeling, but because she has already walked through the fire of her own emotional underworld, and she came back carrying embers instead of ashes. There is a concept in depth psychology that speaks to this directly. Every human being carries within them what is known as the shadow, the rejected, repressed, unacknowledged parts of the self that have been buried beneath layers of social conditioning, fear, and survival instinct. Most people live their entire lives without ever turning around to face this shadow. They project it onto others. They blame the world for their suffering. They repeat the same patterns over and over again, wondering why the same pain keeps finding them, never realizing that the pain was never external. It was always living inside the house they refused to enter. But a woman who has done the devastating, unglamorous, isolating work of shadow integration, a woman who has sat with her own darkness long enough to understand its language, moves through the world differently. She does not react to life the way others do. She responds. And there is a chasm of difference between the two. When a man first encounters this quality in a woman, it disorients him. He tests her, not always consciously, sometimes through withdrawal, sometimes through emotional unavailability, sometimes through subtle provocations designed to see if she will shatter the way others have. But she does not shatter, she observes. She sees the test for what it is, a wounded child knocking on a door, desperate to know if the person on the other side will abandon them the way everyone else has. And instead of reacting with anger or insecurity, she holds her ground with a kind of quiet sovereignty that he has never encountered before. It does not feel like indifference. It feels like standing in the presence of someone who has already survived the worst thing that could happen to her and decided, consciously and deliberately, that she would not let it make her cruel. This is where the psychological crisis begins for him, because her composure is not a performance. It is the residue of suffering that has been fully metabolized. She has taken her grief, her abandonment, her heartbreak, her disillusionment, and she has dissolved it into wisdom the way the ocean dissolves rivers into itself without losing its identity. And the man, who has been carrying his own unmetabolized pain like a stone in his chest for years, suddenly feels its weight more acutely in her presence, not because she reminds him of it, but because her peace makes his chaos louder, her stillness exposes his turbulence, her integration reveals his fragmentation. He begins to realize in this moment that he is not just attracted to her, he is disturbed by her, not in a negative way, but in the way that all truth disturbs, in the way that a mirror disturbs when you have spent years avoiding your own reflection. She becomes, without trying, without intending, the most honest mirror he has ever stood before. And the question that begins to form in the deepest chambers of his unconscious is not, do I want her? The question is, am I ready to become the kind of man who can stand beside someone this real? That question, once it enters the psyche, cannot be unanswered. It will follow him into his sleep, into his silence, into every hollow interaction he has with people who only know how to live on the surface. And it is here, in this trembling space between recognition and resistance, that the next layer of awakening begins to unfold. The second revelation strikes even deeper than the first, and it arrives not through what she says, but through everything she chooses not to say. There is a particular kind of silence that most people fear. It is the silence of emptiness, of disconnection, of having nothing meaningful to offer. But there is another kind of silence, one that is so rare it borders on sacred, and it is the silence of a woman who has learned that her power does not live in her words, but in the quality of her presence. She has discovered, through years of inner excavation, that the loudest voice in any room is often the emptiest, and that the quietest person is frequently the one who holds the most profound understanding of what is actually happening beneath the surface of things. He notices this silence before he understands it. He notices that when she enters a space, the energy does not become louder, it becomes deeper. He notices that when she listens, she does not listen the way others listen, with half an ear, with a response already forming behind her eyes, with the barely concealed desire to redirect the conversation back to herself. She listens the way the earth listens to rain, completely, without resistance, allowing every drop to reach where it needs to go. And the effect this has on a man who has spent his entire life being unheard, who has spoken into rooms where no one was truly receiving him, is nothing short of psychological combustion. From the perspective of the unconscious mind, being truly heard is one of the most vulnerable experiences a human being can endure. We are accustomed to being half heard, to being received through filters and projections and agendas. We have built entire identities around the assumption that no one will ever fully understand us, and we have made peace with that assumption the way prisoners make peace with their cells, not because they love the confinement, but because they have forgotten that the door is unlocked. When a woman listens with her entire being, when her silence becomes a container vast enough to hold the full weight of a man's unspoken truth, it does something to his psyche that nothing else in the world can do. It disarms him. It strips away the armor he did not even know he was wearing. It makes him feel, perhaps for the first time since childhood, that he is safe. But safety, real psychological safety, is not comfortable. It is terrifying, because safety means there is nowhere left to hide. The masks become unnecessary. The performance collapses. The carefully constructed identity that he has built to survive in a world that punished him for being vulnerable begins to crack. And through those cracks, the raw, unedited truth of who he actually is begins to seep out like light through a broken wall. And he looks at her, this woman who has done nothing but be present, and he realizes that she is not just listening to his words, she is listening to his wounds. She is hearing the child behind the man, the fear behind the confidence, the loneliness behind the social mask, and she is not flinching. This is where the psychological transformation becomes irreversible, because once a man has been seen at that depth, once someone has looked at the version of him that he hides from the entire world, and responded not with judgment but with a calm, steady recognition, he can never go back to the shallow connections he once tolerated. He can never again be satisfied by conversations that only touch the surface. He can never again mistake noise for intimacy or performance for presence. She has not changed him through argument or persuasion or demand. She has changed him through the sheer force of her attention, through the radical act of being fully present in a world that has forgotten what presence means. And there is something else happening here, something that operates on an even deeper psychological level. Her silence is not passive, it is active. It is the silence of someone who has learned that not every battle requires a voice, that not every wound requires explanation, that the most powerful response to chaos is often the refusal to participate in it. She has mastered what ancient philosophers understood as the art of inner stillness, the ability to remain centered in her own truth, while the world spins in its endless cycle of noise and reaction. This mastery did not come easily. It was forged in the fires of every misunderstanding she endured in silence, every accusation she absorbed without retaliating, every moment she chose to hold her dignity when everything inside her wanted to scream. It is the accumulated weight of 1,000 quiet victories over her own impulses, and it radiates from her like heat from a stone that has been sitting in the sun all day. He feels this heat. He feels it in the way she does not need to fill the space between them with chatter. He feels it in the way her eyes hold steady when others would look away. He feels it in the way she can sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it, in the way she can witness pain without trying to fix it, in the way she can exist in the truth of a moment without needing it to be different than it is. And slowly, without any conscious decision on his part, his entire nervous system begins to recalibrate around her frequency. He begins to want the silence. He begins to need it. He begins to understand that what he thought was emptiness was actually fullness, and what he thought was distance was actually the closest anyone had ever been to him. As this understanding deepens, as the silence between them becomes a living thing, a shared language written in the spaces between words, he begins to sense something even more profound stirring beneath the surface. Something that connects directly to the way she carries herself when the world is watching, and the way she becomes something entirely different when the masks come off. The third recognition arrives with a kind of quiet shock, the kind that does not announce itself with a gasp but with a slow exhale, the kind that comes when you have been staring at something for a long time and suddenly see it clearly for the first time. He begins to notice that she does not operate within the invisible hierarchy that governs most women's social existence. She does not compete. She does not compare. She does not measure her worth against the reflection of other women, and she does not reduce herself or inflate herself in relation to anyone around her. This is not because she believes she is superior. It is because she has done something far more radical and far more painful. She has withdrawn from a war she never agreed to fight. The modern psychological landscape of femininity is a battlefield that most women are drafted into before they are old enough to understand what is happening. From the earliest age, girls are taught, through media, through family dynamics, through the subtle and not so subtle messaging of a culture that profits from feminine insecurity, that their value is comparative. They learn that beauty is a ranking. They learn that attention is a finite resource that must be fought for. They learn that other women are not sisters but competitors, that every room contains an invisible scoreboard, and that their worth is determined not by who they are, but by how they measure up against the woman standing next to them. This is not a conscious belief. It is an unconscious program, installed so deeply into the psyche that most women do not even realize it is running. They feel it as anxiety at a party. They feel it as a flash of inadequacy when scrolling through images of other women. They feel it as a compulsive need to be chosen, to be validated, to be confirmed as enough by an external gaze. But the woman he is beginning to see has done something extraordinary. She has identified this program. She has traced its roots back to their origin, back to the mother wound, the father wound, the cultural wound, the ancestral wound. She has sat with the excruciating pain of realizing that much of what she thought was her personality was actually a survival strategy, a carefully constructed identity designed to win a game that was rigged from the start. And in that moment of devastating clarity, she made a choice that most people never make. She chose to stop playing. Not with anger, not with bitterness, not with the performative rebellion of someone who wants the world to notice her refusal. She chose to stop playing with the quiet, devastating finality of someone who has simply walked out of a burning building and decided not to go back. This decision cost her enormously. It cost her friendships that were built on shared insecurity. It cost her the approval of women who could only feel powerful in relation to someone they perceived as beneath them. It cost her the comfort of belonging to a tribe, even a tribe defined by mutual suffering. She lost the easy camaraderie of complaint, the familiar warmth of shared victimhood, the social currency of performing fragility for male attention. She lost all of it. And what she gained in its place was something that cannot be taken from her, a relationship with her own femininity that is rooted in sovereignty rather than submission, in self-knowledge rather than external validation, in the deep, ancient, untamed power of a woman who has reclaimed herself from a world that tried to define her before she could define herself. When a man begins to sense this about a woman, when he begins to realize that she does not need him to confirm her beauty, her intelligence, her worth, her right to exist, it creates a kind of psychological vertigo that is unlike anything he has experienced before. He has been trained, just as she was trained, to expect certain things from feminine energy. He has been conditioned to believe that women need to be needed, that their desire for connection is actually a desire for dependency, that their emotional depth is actually emotional weakness. And then he meets her, and every one of these assumptions crumbles like a house built on sand. She does not need him. She chooses him. And the difference between needing and choosing is the difference between a prison and a garden. This distinction rewires something in his unconscious mind. It forces him to confront his own relationship with power and control. He realizes, perhaps with discomfort, that much of what he called love in the past was actually a form of possession, a desire to be needed so deeply that the other person could not leave. He realizes that his attraction to feminine fragility was not protectiveness but a projection of his own fear of abandonment, a strategy to ensure that he would never be left by making sure the other person could not survive without him. And in the presence of a woman who does not need him to survive, who is whole and complete in her solitude, who could walk away tomorrow and grieve and heal, and continue to exist with her dignity intact, he is forced to ask himself the most uncomfortable question a man can face. Am I capable of loving someone I cannot control? This question is the gateway to everything. It is the beginning of emotional maturity, the first step toward a love that is not transactional, not conditional, not rooted in fear. And it is a question that could only be provoked by a woman who has already answered it for herself. A woman who has already learned to love without clinging, to give without depleting, to open without losing herself. She has become, through her own suffering and her own inner work, the embodiment of a kind of feminine power that the world does not teach, does not reward, and does not understand. And yet it is the only kind of power that can truly transform another human being. And as he stands in the presence of this power, trembling at the edge of his own expansion, he begins to notice something about the way she handles the most difficult moments, the way she navigates conflict and misunderstanding, and the inevitable friction of two wounded souls trying to find their way toward each other. There is a moment in every deeply honest connection where one person's pain meets another person's boundaries, and what happens in that moment determines whether the relationship will become a sanctuary or a cemetery. Most people, when they encounter another person's wounds, respond in one of two equally destructive ways. They either absorb the wound, taking it upon themselves as a project, a mission, a reason to exist, slowly drowning in the gravity of someone else's suffering until they forget where they end and the other person begins. Or they reject the wound entirely, responding to vulnerability with impatience, to tears with contempt, to need with withdrawal, creating an environment where honesty becomes a punishable offense and the only safe strategy is silence. Both responses come from fear. The first comes from the fear of being unloved if you do not sacrifice yourself. The second comes from the fear of being overwhelmed if you allow yourself to feel. But the woman who has been forged by her own inner work stands in a different place entirely. She stands in the space between absorption and rejection, the space that might be called compassionate sovereignty, the ability to witness another person's suffering without making it about herself, to hold space without losing space, to offer understanding without offering herself as a sacrifice. When a man brings his wounds to her, and every man will eventually bring his wounds, because that is what intimacy demands, she does not recoil, and she does not rush to fix. She sits with him in the darkness. She acknowledges the pain without romanticizing it. She says, through her presence and her steadiness, I see this, I honor this, but this is yours to carry, and I trust you to carry it. This is one of the most psychologically disorienting experiences a man can have. He has been conditioned, through every relationship model he has ever observed, to believe that love means rescue. He has been taught, through fairy tales and films, and the unconscious modeling of his own family, that the woman who truly loves him will save him from himself, will absorb his darkness into her light, will sacrifice her own wholeness on the altar of his brokenness. And when she refuses to do this, when she stands beside him without stepping in front of him, when she offers her hand without offering to carry his weight, the initial response is often anger, confusion, the wounded cry of a child who has been told that they must walk on their own legs. But beneath that initial reaction, something far more profound is taking shape. He begins to realize that her refusal to carry his wounds is not a rejection. It is the highest form of respect. She is treating him as a whole person, capable of his own transformation, strong enough to face his own shadows, worthy of his own journey. She is refusing to infantilize him, refusing to reduce him to a project, refusing to make his healing her responsibility because she understands, with the deep wisdom of someone who has healed herself, that healing cannot be given. It can only be chosen. And by holding this boundary, by maintaining this exquisite balance between compassion and sovereignty, she is giving him something no one has ever given him before. She is giving him the dignity of his own process. This is where the shadow work of the relationship reaches its most intense and transformative phase. Because her boundaries force him to confront the parts of himself he has been outsourcing to others for his entire life. Every time he wanted a woman to make him feel worthy, he was avoiding the internal work of building his own sense of worth. Every time he wanted a woman to calm his anxiety, he was avoiding the internal work of learning to regulate his own nervous system. Every time he wanted a woman to give his life meaning, he was avoiding the existential confrontation with the void that every human being must face if they are to build a life of genuine purpose rather than borrowed purpose. And now, standing before a woman who loves him but will not save him, he must do what he has been avoiding. He must save himself. The psychological literature on individuation, the process of becoming a complete, integrated human being, makes it clear that this process cannot happen in isolation, but it also cannot happen through dependency. It happens in the space between two whole people, each doing their own work, each holding their own center, each offering their presence without offering their dissolution. She understands this intuitively, not because she read it in a book, but because she lived it. She has already walked the agonizing road of learning to be her own anchor, her own witness, her own source of validation. She knows what it costs. She knows how lonely it is. And she knows that the only gift worth giving is the gift of believing in someone's capacity to do the same. And as he begins to understand this, as the initial sting of her boundaries transforms into a deep, reverent gratitude, as he begins to do the work that her presence has demanded of him, something remarkable begins to happen. He starts to grow, not because she pushed him, not because she nagged him, not because she threatened to leave, but because her wholeness made his incompleteness unbearable. Her integration made his fragmentation visible. Her peace made his chaos something he could no longer ignore. And in growing, in facing himself with the kind of courage that only comes from being loved without being enabled, he begins to approach something that few people ever reach, a psychological threshold where everything he thought he was dissolves, and something truer, something more essential, begins to emerge. And it is at this threshold, this sacred and terrifying borderland between the old self and the new, that the final and most devastating recognition takes place. The final awakening is the one that reorganizes everything. It does not come as a thought. It comes as a feeling, a sudden, overwhelming, almost unbearable flood of recognition that rises from the deepest part of the unconscious mind and washes over the entire landscape of his identity, like a tide that reshapes the shore. He realizes in this moment that she never once tried to change him. She never once asked him to be different. She never once issued an ultimatum, delivered a lecture, created a list of demands, or threatened to withdraw her love if he did not become someone else. She simply existed as herself, fully, completely, without apology, without compromise, without the slightest willingness to diminish her own truth to accommodate his comfort. And in doing so, she changed everything. This is one of the most paradoxical truths in all of psychology. The people who try hardest to change others are the ones who create the most resistance. The people who simply embody their own transformation become irresistible catalysts for everyone around them. It is not action that changes the world, it is presence. It is not persuasion that transforms a soul, it is authenticity. And she has been authentic from the very beginning, not as a strategy, not as a performance, not as a mask designed to appear maskless, but as the natural expression of a woman who has done the devastating, beautiful, unending work of knowing herself. He thinks back to who he was before he met her, and the distance between that man and the man he is becoming seems impossibly vast. He remembers the way he used to move through relationships like a tourist, collecting experiences, enjoying surfaces, never staying long enough in any one place for the roots to take hold. He remembers the way he used to mistake intensity for intimacy, chaos for passion, possession for love. He remembers the masks he wore, the carefully constructed versions of himself that he deployed for different audiences. The charming version, the strong version, the wounded version, the indifferent version. He wore them so well that he forgot they were masks. He forgot that beneath all of them was a face he had never shown anyone, a face he had never even shown himself. And then she came. And she did not ask to see his face. She simply showed him hers. She stood before him without armor, without pretense, without the desperate need to be seen in a particular way. She showed him her scars, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a map, as evidence that survival is possible, that the darkest nights do end, that the self can be broken and rebuilt and broken and rebuilt and emerge, each time more true, more essential, more luminous. She showed him that strength is not the absence of vulnerability. Strength is the willingness to be vulnerable in a world that punishes vulnerability, to be soft in a culture that worships hardness, to be honest in a society that runs on deception. And in the presence of this honesty, his own masks began to feel suffocating. They began to feel heavy. They began to feel like the prison they had always been, though he had decorated the prison so beautifully that he had mistaken it for a home. One by one, they fell away. The strong mask, the charming mask, the indifferent mask, each one falling like dead leaves from a tree that is finally, after a long and reluctant autumn, preparing for the vulnerability of winter, the bare, honest, terrifying openness of standing without foliage, without protection, without anything between you and the sky. This is individuation in its most lived, most visceral form. It is not a concept from a textbook. It is the lived experience of a human being who has been cracked open by the presence of someone who refused to participate in the collective delusion of surface-level existence. It is the moment when a man stops performing masculinity and begins embodying it, not the brittle, reactive, defensive masculinity that the world teaches, but the rooted, present, emotionally expansive masculinity that can only emerge when a man has faced his own depths and decided that he would rather be real than be safe. He understands now, with a clarity that feels almost sacred, that she did not save him. She's something far more powerful than saving. She witnessed him. She held up a mirror that did not distort, did not flatter, did not comfort, but simply showed the truth. And the truth, as it always does, set something free. Not immediately, not painlessly, not without loss, but irreversibly. Because once you have seen yourself clearly, once you have stood in the full, unedited reality of who you are, shadows and light, wounds and wisdom, brokenness and beauty, there is no going back to the comfortable lie of who you thought you were. He realizes now that the moment he recognized her as different was not the moment he fell in love with her. It was the moment he fell in love with himself, the real self, the self that had been waiting beneath the layers of conditioning and fear and performance for someone brave enough to see it. She did not create this self. It was always there. But she was the one who looked at it without flinching, and in her unflinching gaze, it finally had permission to exist. And this is what it means, in the deepest psychological sense, to be not like other women. It does not mean being better. It does not mean being superior. It does not mean competing in a hierarchy of depth or winning a contest of emotional intelligence. It means having done the sacred, solitary, often devastating work of meeting yourself in the dark. It means having walked into the cave of your own unconscious and stayed there long enough to learn its language. It means having integrated the parts of yourself that the world told you to reject and emerging not as a perfect person, but as a real one. It means being the kind of presence that does not demand transformation, but inspires it simply by existing. There is a threshold that exists in every human life, a line between the person you were and the person you are becoming, and you do not cross it with intention. You cross it with surrender. You cross it the way a river crosses a cliff, not by deciding to become a waterfall, but by flowing so honestly in its own direction that the only possible outcome is a transformation that reshapes the landscape forever. This is what happens when a man truly recognizes the depth of a woman who has done her inner work. He does not merely admire her, he is remade by her, not because she demanded it, but because her authenticity made his illusions uninhabitable. What we have walked through together in this journey is not a portrait of a perfect woman. There is no such thing, and the pursuit of perfection is itself a form of psychological violence against the self. What we have explored is something far more real and far more powerful. We have explored what it means to be a woman who has met her own darkness, who has sat with her own suffering until it spoke its wisdom, who has refused to betray herself in exchange for the cheap comfort of belonging. We have explored what it means to carry silence like a cathedral, to hold boundaries like sacred architecture, to love without possessing, to see without judging, to stand in your own truth even when the world begs you to kneel. And for the men who encounter this kind of woman, the lesson is equally profound and equally painful. You cannot earn her depth by performing yours. You cannot match her presence with pretense. You cannot meet her honesty with strategy. The only way to stand beside a woman like this is to become a man who has done his own equal work, who has faced his own shadows, who has earned his own silence, who has learned to love without clinging, to lead without controlling, to be strong without being hard. The only way to truly see her is to first be willing to see yourself. If this journey spoke to something deep within you, something you have felt but never had words for, something that stirred in the quiet places of your memory or your longing, then perhaps it was not an accident that you found your way here tonight. Perhaps the part of you that has always known there was more depth, more truth, more meaning, more connection, was the part that led you to these words. And if that is the case, then honor it. Do not let this moment pass as mere entertainment or background noise. Let it settle into you. Let ask its questions. Let it disturb the comfortable narratives you have built around who you are and who you are becoming. Leave a quiet sign below, not for the algorithm, not for the comment section, but for yourself. A small act of acknowledgement that something shifted tonight, that something in the architecture of your inner world has been rearranged, however slightly, however silently. Walk with us further on this path, not because you are incomplete, but because the journey toward wholeness has no destination, only depth. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that every step was always leading you back to yourself. You were never lost. You were just learning to see in the dark. And now, the darkness does not frighten you anymore, because you have discovered what the ancient philosophers always knew, what the deepest psychology has always taught, what every honest human being eventually learns through the sacred curriculum of suffering and growth. The light was never outside of you. It was always burning quietly, patiently, indomitably within, waiting for the moment you were brave enough to stop looking elsewhere and finally turn inward, toward the one place you had been afraid to go, toward the one person you had been afraid to become, you. That is the moment of recognition. That is the awakening, and it changes everything.